Thank you everyone for joining us for our February panel event titled No COVID Evictions, Organizing Against Evictions and Encampment Clearance in Toronto. My name is Emily and I'll be moderating today's event. I am grateful to be joined by four panelists, Jesse Upton Crowe, Emina Gamulin, Brendan Jowett, and Philip Zigman. This event is sponsored by the U of T School of Cities, an interdisciplinary urban research hub for faculty, students, and community members. I'll start by acknowledging the land on which we are gathered today and which the University of Toronto occupies. For thousands of years, it has been the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and the Mississaugas of the Credit River. And the land is still home to many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island. The plan for today's event is as follows. I'll provide a short introduction to the topic and introduce the panelists. We'll then have approximately an hour of panel discussion, and we'll aim to leave half an hour at the end for audience question and answer. So please keep your microphone on mute throughout the event to reduce background noise. If you have a question for one of the panelists, please post it in the chat and I'll read it out during the Q&A portion at the end. Also, please note this is being recorded and portions of the event may be posted online afterwards. So you may wish to keep your video off for this reason. So I'll provide a short introduction, kind of a background on the housing crisis in Toronto. The pandemic housing crisis continues in Toronto. The most recent rental market survey from the Canada Mortgage and Housing Corporation reported 1 in 10 Toronto renter households are behind on rent and at risk of eviction. That's 35,000 households. Despite rising rates of COVID-19 infection and growing unemployment, Ontario's eviction ban was lifted and the Landlord-Tenant Board reopened for eviction hearings. More than 13,000 hearings have been held from November through January. Hearings are taking place over Microsoft Teams with 16 eviction cases scheduled for each block, and the average hearing lasting only 8 minutes. Just today, the East York 50, a group of 50 tenants from Crescent Town and Goodwood Park, were brought before the board by Pinedale Properties and Renee Management, two of the biggest pandemic evictors in the city. A slate of new adjudicators was hired in the last few months to process this backlog, many of them with backgrounds working at landlord-side law firms, as police or RCMP officers, and as landlords and property managers. At the same time, tenants' legal defenses have been weakened. The Ford government cut the legal aid budget by 30% back in 2019, and legal clinics have been stretched to the limit, unable to support everyone who needs help. Ontario is the only jurisdiction in North America that has passed legislation during the pandemic, making eviction faster and easier for landlords. Bill 184 was passed by the Ford government in July 2020, amending the Residential Tenancies Act. And landlords can now negotiate rent repayment plans directly with tenants without needing to attend the board. If the repayment agreement includes a certain clause, the landlord can file for an expedited eviction if the tenant is a day late or $1 short on the payment schedule. And many tenants are now being coerced into repayment plans they cannot afford. Similarly, repayment plans handed down by the board include this clause by default. And so tenants are being saddled with large debts they cannot repay, simply delaying eviction and homelessness by a few months. Meanwhile, landlords have expanded their holdings and increased their profits during the pandemic. A profit margin of 60 to 70% is typical. For example, Cap REIT, Canada's largest landlord, had a profit margin of 65% in 2020, valued at $430 million by the third quarter of last year. While landlords can clearly afford to absorb the cost of rent arrears and provide real relief, they are instead asking for a government bailout. The Federation of Rental Housing Providers of Ontario has suggested landlords will accept a loss of 25%, but want the government and tenants to foot the bill for the remainder. It is little wonder the homeless population in Toronto is growing rapidly. Shelters are consistently full, and there are dozens of encampments and parks across the city. The second wave of COVID-19 has taken its toll. Last month, Toronto Public Health reported 10 outbreaks in the shelter system. At the same time, City of Toronto bylaw officers and police continue to harass people seeking shelter in places like Union Station and to evict people living in tents and small structures in public parks. In response to landlord greed and government inaction, working class people are taking matters into their own hands. They are organizing collectively to defend their homes and provide for their needs. Under the umbrella of the Keep Your Rent campaign, tenants from Parkdale, East York, the Annex, Scarborough, Malton, and Weston have led the charge in organizing to demand rent relief and against evictions. Tenants have withheld rent in solidarity with poorer neighbors, brought their demands to the front door of their landlord's mansions, shut down eviction hearings, and blocked the sheriff from removing people from their homes. Since last spring, the Encampment Support Network volunteers have provided support to houseless people living in encampments in 6 neighborhoods across Toronto. They provide food, camping supplies, clothing, and sanitary equipment, addressing people's daily needs for survival when the city won't. So we are very grateful to have organizers from Keep Your Rent and the Encampment Support Network here with us today. Jesse Upton Crowe is a volunteer with the Encampment Support Network. Brendan Jowett is a staff lawyer with Neighbourhood Legal Services, a legal clinic serving downtown Eastern Toronto, and a board member with the Federation of Metro Tenants Associations. Brendan was part of the legal team that fought the City of Toronto in court over the city's encampments clearance policy. Third, Emina Gamulin is a Parkdale tenant and an organizer with Keep Your Rent Toronto. And finally, Philip Ziegman is co-creator of several websites in support of Keep Your Rent and other tenant groups in Toronto, including renevictionsto.com and torontocovidevictions.com. Thanks for joining us for this panel. I'll start with some questions for Emina and Jesse. Emina, how about we start with you and then pass it off to Jesse. First, can you describe the types of organizing you've undertaken since the pandemic began? What successes have you had? What challenges have you faced? And how have you needed to adapt your approach in response to changing conditions?
Sure. Well, thanks for having me and inviting me to talk about the Keep Your Rent movement tonight with you guys. So yeah, I mean, basically, Keep Your Rent was a movement that was started because of the COVID crisis. I think, organizers who've been doing tenant organizing for a while sort of saw what was to come, right? Like, we were faced with this sort of very serious global pandemic where a lot of people would be out of work, and there's a sort of already pre-existing crisis for poor people, people in working class neighborhoods, people being displaced, people being evicted because of the greed of landlords wanting to extract higher and higher rents from tenants, right? And so these things were kind of coming to a head, and with COVID and people out of work, basically this crisis that was already really horrible was going to get a lot worse, right? And so people understood the need for tenants to organize, right? And so, as you very succinctly kind of put forward, Keep Your Rent was for tenants who were unable to pay the rent, to hold back their rent, but not do it alone, right? To organize with other tenants so they could be doing it safely, and also, provides an opportunity for tenants who are maybe in a bit more of a stable situation to also hold their rent in solidarity with those tenants. And so, yeah, like it's really, the organizing has looked different kind of depending on what stages of the pandemic we were at. But I mean, a lot of it, in the day to day is just, helping, tenants who, I have said they're behind, helping them find other tenants in their building and neighborhood to organize with, postering, door knocking, flyering, setting up Facebook groups and WhatsApp groups for tenants to communicate, setting up lawn meetings for tenants to communicate and discuss demands, and then also sort of coming together across different neighborhoods for bigger action. So Parkdale organize, getting together with tenants in Kensington, getting in together with tenants in East York, and doing actions like, protests at Queen's Park, the protests we did outside John Tory's condo, stopping and eviction enforcement from the level of like deploying the sheriffs kind of thing. And so it's been, like kind of depending on where we were in the crisis, I think there were sort of different focuses. I mean, obviously at every point it's looking at stopping evictions by organizing with neighbors, right? But this kind of took a focus at different times. So when the first eviction moratorium was happening, that moratorium also included most types of eviction hearings. And so at that time, the focus was more on like, okay, who are the tenants who are behind on rent? We did, our own research where we did surveys, and we actually found about 1 in 10 tenants were behind on rents. Ended up kind of being the same numbers that the mortgage corporation kind of put out. And then later on, like when that moratorium was lifted and hearings started again, that work maybe shifted to more like, okay, there's an immediate crisis where like someone has a sheriff coming to their door the next day and you have to stop that. So organizing with neighbors to stop things like that, intervening in hearings, where tenants are maybe not understanding the process, didn't have an opportunity to get support from legal aid. There's technical difficulties, all those sorts of things. So basically stopping it at every point, but kind of depending on what's happening on the ground, we would just have to sort of shift. Obviously, COVID has been a huge factor in the organizing, right? So we're organizing against COVID evictions, but also, COVID can kind of, put restraints on the type of organizing you might be able to do. So for example, like, lobby meetings were something that Parkdale Organize has always been really big on. That's not something that has been as much of a thing in organizing during COVID. So it looked more like, maybe socially distanced lawn meetings, or perhaps doing like, a phone call or a Zoom or something instead, right? Kind of knowing when it might be safe to knock on doors, and when, a flyer under the door might be more appropriate, those kinds of things. So kind of constantly having to kind of adapt to what's going on the ground, I guess. I mean, in terms of successes, I think like, in neighborhoods like Parkdale, where there's been strong organizing for a long time as a result of, Parkdale Organize, the work that Parkdale Organize has been doing, I think a lot of the landlords have been pretty hands-off in terms of, writing up eviction notices, bringing their tenants to hearings. Like we've actually seen from a lot of the bigger landlords less of this, right? Like they're still holding back. We know obviously this could change at any moment. And we know that, when they think it's, politically okay for them to do so, that they might do that. But we have seen them kind of taking, a bit of a step back. And I think that's a direct result of organizing. And sometimes you'll see it where you'll see a landlord applying for evictions in one neighborhood, but not in another, right? So we know that when we organize together, it works. And then other times, maybe they tried, but the organizing was able to stop them. So for example, in my building early on in the pandemic, this was like, a couple days into the lockdown kind of thing, my landlord issued a bunch of my neighbors eviction notices. Thankfully, we had already been organizing, so we were able to kind of quickly respond, and we decided to do like, plastered our building in signs. We did like social media, got some media attention. We did phone zaps and things like that with the help of Parkdale Organize, and the public pressure worked. They claimed it was a big mistake, and then they ripped up those eviction notices, which was great because when that moratorium was lifted, my neighbor did not then have to go, sit in front of the board and potentially be evicted at that time, right? But I do know that in neighborhoods where, people have the same landlord and they were less organized, there have been hearings, right? So we can kind of see the difference in that way. I think those are some of the ways you can kind of gauge success. And yeah, challenges, I mean, I think I've talked about them. I think it's always the same, like with organizing, like, there can be a lot of fear for people for organizing, but I think once they come to realize that the landlord's not going to keep you safe, the government isn't going to keep you safe. Like our legislation has actually weakened for tenants under the Ford government during the crisis. They were the only, I believe, political body to do so in North America. So that's not going to keep us safe, right? The only thing that's going to keep us safe is sticking together and putting the pressure, right? And and talking to so many tenants, like most tenants understand that it's the good and decent thing to keep tenants in their homes, right? No one wants to see their neighbors thrown out, but unfortunately there hasn't been necessarily the political will, the will from our landlords and so forth, right? So I think that's always just like a common organizing challenge. Sorry if I talked too long there.
No, that was great. Thanks, Emina. Jesse, same questions to you. The types of organizing you've undertaken, successes, challenges, response from the city.
Yep. So I'm with ESN Parkdale, which ESN has all these different groups, but it started out as more of a rapid response group. So when the city was proposing evictions for people living under the Gardner, there was a rapid response that got a whole bunch of people together to at least try to advocate for those who were living in that encampment and to stop things. And though they didn't necessarily stop the eviction, definitely by putting things on social media and starting to get people, have people be aware of the encampment residents being harassed, it started to have people actually come out and advocate for them. So obviously during COVID, so many more people have ended up becoming homeless. Shelters are running at about 30% in order to try to have everyone spaced out enough. So that leaves a lot of people now living in encampments. On a daily basis, we visit multiple encampments, bringing fire safety, water, Gatorade, tents, tarps, basically trying to fill the gap that the city is not providing, especially during COVID. We have been advocates for better conditions in encampments, trying to help end encampment eviction, and as well as reporting on the city for where they've been lacking in their COVID plan. Long and short, we try our best to ask people what they want and what they need, listen to their struggles with housing and with trying to get into hotels or shelter hotels or trying to get a shelter bed, and things like trying to advocate for people to keep their methods of heating. I would say successes would be that I think the city is a little intimidated by us in a little bit of a way, to be honest. ESN has become a bit of a watchdog for what's going on at encampments by using rapid response in social media. Evictions can no longer be done in a way that they're invisible or kind of out of sight of the public. It seems as though police have slowed down a bit of their involvement with the clearings, not to say that they aren't still making the lives of encampment members really horrible in other ways, by like slicing through tents or stealing heat sources. But I think a little bit of the public shaming over social media and just being around to ask people what's going on has made it so that the city's had to be a little bit more accountable in that way. Yeah, so still working on it, still lots of encampments going on, but seems as though the actual eviction side of things is really slowing down right now, and people are a little bit more settled. So that's been really good to see.
Thanks, Jesse. The next question is for Brendan, who was involved in the legal team fighting the City of Toronto on the encampment clearance. Can you describe the process of fighting the city in court? What arguments did you put forward? How did the city respond? And how did you maintain accountability to people living in encampment?
There's a lot there. So what I mean, in terms of like the process of the court case, the organizing around that started like very shortly after the pandemic kind of came down, and the rise of encampments became this just like such a visible piece of the pandemic and such a sign of the housing crisis in Toronto. There was like, everyone knew that the city was at some point going to clamp down on encampments and start trying to pressure them to leave. And so, from the very outset, we were thinking ahead to like what might happen if we had to bring a lawsuit and if we had to fight the city in court. And so we kind of modeled our approach to litigation that's been brought in BC. There's a long history of tent city litigation in BC, mostly revolving around public parks. And so we have been advising people that if there is going to be a court challenge or a court case, it's probably best to keep it to public parks. And so we're working within the same legal framework. So, that process was started like at very, very early on in the pandemic. It really came to a head in July when the cops started to, or rather the city started to put pressure on people at Moss Park. I work at Neighbourhood Legal Services, which is just across the street from Moss Park. They issued notices to people saying, remove your property and like vacate the park. And they gave them a 24-hour notice, and they kind of, legally, they were technically required to give them 72 hours. And so we wrote a demand letter to the city saying, this is an illegal notice and you have to back down. So the city backed down on that. And then we immediately filed our lawsuit. I think about 3 days later, we sued the city in court. And in the intervening period, they actually issued a trespass notice against encampment residents at Moss Park, which was the same tactic that they used to displace the Occupy movement from St. James Park. So that was what, like, we knew that they would eventually go with the trespass notice. So we were able to file really quickly, and the city like pretty quickly backed down, actually, in terms of moving ahead with really aggressive encampment clearances. They still certainly were clearing some of the camps out, but in terms of like showing up with bulldozers and issuing like mass eviction notices to encampments, it seems like it's slowed down. In terms of like the legal case that we brought, it was a challenge under the charter, saying that this trespass notice violated the rights to life, liberty, and security of person, as well as the equality rights of homeless encampment residents. The basis of the argument was really that people who were living in encampments don't want to go into shelters. And the city is saying we're giving people spaces. We are we're offering people warm beds, and they have to go to a safe bed. But shelters are not safe places for everybody, and they're not desirable places for everyone for many different reasons. And so for whatever various reasons, including what was just uniform across the board was a concern about COVID and the risk of COVID getting into shelters. That was the grounds upon which we said that no, the shelters are not a safe place for people to go, or at the very least that they have to have the right to be able to make that decision for themselves as to whether they're willing to go in. And like, keep in mind that the city dragged its feet on enforcing social distancing in shelters. They took months and a legal challenge to do anything, despite the fact that the alarm bells are going off in January and February of 2020. And so like the foundation of our argument was that because of the risk of COVID, which is it's a subjective risk based on objective facts. People should not be required to be forced into shelter spaces, and it's a violation of their rights to evict them from the parks. So yeah, the case was ultimately heard. So we brought this charter challenge against the trespass notices, and then we brought a motion for an injunction to stop the city from clearing encampments while the case was decided. And I mean, really, in these kinds of cases, like an injunction is very important to the next steps in terms of the strategy, because it maintains the status quo. And so that was heard in October, and unfortunately, we lost that case. But in the meantime, and the judge's reasoning was based on this, what I think is like a faulty reasoning that that there's plenty of shelter space, which all of us know that there's not. That the shelters were safe, which, kind of regardless of what the numbers are, people feel unsafe in shelters. I know of 9 overdose deaths that happened of people who were alone in the shelter hotel rooms, and have had to like change their routines, and so these like really like it's like life and death for these folks, and so we lost the court case, but at the same time, you have groups like the Encampment Support Network that were organizing ferociously on the ground and built a resistance that was stronger than I think even a legal decision would have been. I think that they built they really instilled a fear on the part of the city of what will happen if they're seen to be coming into these encampments and clearing them out, and forcing people into these situations. So there was a real kind of like a lot of work between us and the Encampment Support Network, and then 2 of our clients were the Ontario Coalition Against Poverty and Toronto Overdose Prevention Society, as well as 14 homeless individuals. But it created the opportunity and gave some time for organizing to happen that I think has, really stabilized the situation for people in encampments. I won't go any longer, but that's a rough overview.
Thanks, Brendan. My next question is for Phil. Research and public education has played a big role in the Keep Your Rent campaign, with organizers publishing several websites that name and shame key players in the COVID evictions crisis. For example, landlordsoftoronto.com, evictionsontario.ca. You have also published 2 websites, torontocovidevictions.com and renevictions.to.com. Can you describe how you went about researching and developing these websites, and your goals for how these websites can support organizing efforts?
Yeah, thanks. So I think I could say a bit about RenEvictions.to and the COVID eviction site, and then Emina could say a bit more about that, and as well talk about the other websites that Keep Your Rent created. Does that work? Okay. So the COVID eviction site basically piggybacked off of Rent Evictions TO. That website was inspired by eviction mapping projects in the States, and I think there were two main goals for Rent Evictions TO. One was really just to try to document what was happening in the city, kind of like Emina touched on already. A lot of the issues for renters in the city, the housing crisis, it pre-existed COVID. So we knew rent evictions and above guideline rent increases were big issues, but there wasn't really a lot of data being collected about it, certainly no data being made public. So one goal was just to document this, show the scale of the problem, and make this information public, name the landlords who are kind of doing these things. And another goal was to support tenant organizing. So we really wanted to create something that would be a useful tool for tenants, that would give tenants information about how they could fight rent evictions and Aggies. And again, just creating something for tenants that would be helpful for tenant organizing. So this meant early on in the process, speaking with lots of tenants, learning from tenants' firsthand experiences with rent evictions and Aggies. We're trying to find out what they would find useful, what they would like to see in the website, what kind of information and tool would be helpful to them. And also speaking with lots of tenant organizers, community legal clinic workers, just people who had firsthand experience with these things and supporting tenants fighting them. And this process really shaped not only the content that appears on the website, but also the basic functionality of the site kind of fell out of this process of speaking with tenants. Like we started working on the site like about a year ago, but then the pandemic happened. The pandemic started a little bit before we launched, which was about last May or June. And as we were kind of finishing it up, that's when Keep Your Rent started and all that organizing was going on. And then I guess like a couple of months after we launched the site, we started talking with Keep Your Rent about the idea of setting up a website to track COVID evictions. And I mean, even though Rent Evictions TO had only kind of been out for a couple of months at that point, it was clear that tenants would reach out through the website. We were getting quite a few tenants reaching out who weren't already involved in tenant organizing. So through the website, we're able to connect these tenants to other tenants, make sure they understood their rights, had legal support if needed, and we were able to support tenants organizing to remain in their homes if that's what they wanted to do. And it also seemed like the map helped get some attention. It got a little bit more, I guess, than we thought it would. And it seemed that kind of depicting things visually helped communicate information about the issue, but also helped bring some attention to it. So I guess it was probably like right around when the first moratorium lifted. I forget if it was like July, August, but over the summer when that first eviction moratorium was lifted, a COVID eviction site seemed like a good way to bring some attention to the evictions that we knew were coming, but also help tenants connect so that tenants wouldn't be alone. At that point, creating this site was pretty straightforward. We basically just talked with Keep Your Rent, figured out what they wanted. We cloned the Rent Evictions TO site and then just made some minor changes, cut it down and simplified it. It was basically just figuring out what Keep Your Rent thought would be useful for their organizing, what they thought tenants would find useful, what they needed, and then just creating that. And then we kind of just passed it over to them. So they've been managing and operating the site since it was created. I can't speak for everyone involved, but at least from my perspective, the COVID eviction tracker, it seemed basically just like a good way to document some portion of what was going on. Like there's no way we're going to reach every tenant who's facing eviction during the crisis. But whereas there are a lot of tenants who are already connected to Keep Your Rent organizing, there are lots of tenants in the city who aren't. So it seemed like the website could be a good way to try to reach those tenants, to connect them to Keep Your Rent, connect them to other tenants and the broader struggle, and just help them get information about their rights and about organizing to fight evictions. At least for me, that was kind of the idea behind this site. But I think this is where Emina could pick things up on the COVID tracker.
Sure, yeah. So I mean, I think Phil outlined it really well, like the COVID tracker, you know, is a way for, you know, tenants to let people know that there are evictions happening at their address and kind of what stage of the eviction it's at. And then it also gives organizers an opportunity to then call them, reach out, see what they need, what they're looking for, you know, hook them up with a local legal clinic if that's something that's needed, figure out what an organizing strategy might be. Like, do you live in a building? Oh, we already know, we actually have contacts already in that building. Are you alone and, you know, your landlord's like upstairs and you're in the basement, right? Like, so kind of figuring out strategies together with tenants and then, you know, connecting them through there. And then I guess sites like, you know, Landlords of Toronto and Evictions Ontario, like those aren't like my sites or whatever. A lot of you know, tenants put in work into creating those sites. But I mean, I guess a couple different things. Like, I think number one, and you know, sometimes I think in the liberal imagination, you know, you have tenants on the one hand, you know, tenants are in a bad situation. They're potentially facing eviction. They don't know their rights. And then we've got experts on the other hand, and these are the sort of the people that you go to for the research and the answers and these kinds of things. And we're saying, well, no, like we're one and the same, right? Like, so all of this work was put together, you know, by tenants who, you know, did the research to find out who are our landlords, what are the properties they own, you know, what kind of activities do they do outside of their landlord work? I guess you could call it kind of like naming and shaming kind of thing, but I think it's just kind of showing who the people are behind these companies. Like, a lot of the time you don't know, right? Like, they're very, you know, landlords are very good at kind of hiding behind corporations. I mean, my landlord is, you know, it's a number of numbered corporations for every address kind of thing. So helping tenants understand like who their landlords are can then help them, you know, put pressure on those landlords. And again, it's a tool for people to connect. So they reach out and they say, hey, this is also my landlord. This was also my experience. And we're like, great, we can, you know, connect you now to other organizers in your neighborhood, other tenants who also, you know, have the experience and that sort of shared collective knowledge of what organizing looks like when dealing with these kinds of landlords. And same with Evictions Ontario, right? It's just sort of exposing the process that's been going on at the Landlord Tenant Board, you know, for a long time now. Like every year since that tribunal has started, 9 out of every 10 filings there are landlord filings, and those are overwhelmingly eviction filings. So we know the Landlord Tenant Board essentially, you know, by and large, what they do is they evict tenants, right? That's the bulk of the work that happens at the Landlord Tenant Board. So it's exposing that, but also showing tenants where are evictions happening? Well, actually, they're happening everywhere in every neighborhood, right? Which is why we need tenants organizing in every neighborhood. And like Phil said, like, I mean, it's a visual thing. I think it has impact for people, so that can kind of create interest, I guess, for people. But you know, the most important thing, of course, is actual organizing, because that's what's going to ultimately keep us safe and in our homes, kind of thing.
Thanks. I also want to ask Phil and Emina, what other kinds of research do you think could be useful to tenant movements in Toronto?
Phil, did you want to go, or I can?
Up to you. You could take a stab at it, then I could see if there's anything to
add. I mean, I talked about it with some other organizers and a little bit with Phil. I mean, some of the things we really don't know or have a good understanding of, I think, is, you know, we have done a lot of research in terms of what landlord owns what, but a lot of this is kind of still quite obfuscated, right? I think I see a note here about a number of units. So that, yeah, exactly, that's something that would be useful to know. Like, in some cases, we have a general sense. In some cases we do know, but in a lot of cases this information is not available publicly. And even, you know, people who are professional researchers, you know, struggle to find this work. So that's kind of information that would definitely be useful to know. There's definitely like clues to looking. You could look at city databases. You know, you could just look at all the buildings they own and then, like, you know, do the research to figure out how many units there are in every unit. So I think that would be useful. I mean, I guess the other thing is we don't actually know how many evictions are actually enforced by the landlord tenant board, which is pretty wild that they apparently don't even keep track of their own evictions. And so, I mean, again, I think this is a challenging thing for someone to take on as a research project, because I mean, ultimately, like, I think pressure would have to be put on the board to release that information. Now, there have been, efforts to kind of make these kind of tribunals more open. Like I know the Toronto Star put in a legal challenge a while ago because the tribunals were so secretive with their information and it was taking so long. And I know that they did get a ruling that said like the tribunals are under the open courts principles, and in practice they should be kind of releasing information in a more open way. But we're still seeing, like, especially during the COVID eviction crisis, people are asking for basic information like, how many hearings did you have in this 2-month period? And then they take a month and a half to respond, and they say that's a freedom of information, which again is going to take like more and more months, right? But yeah, like actually having numbers for how many hearings they order would be really good information to know. Like I think with Evictions Ontario, our best approximation was how many hearings are scheduled, right? That kind of gives us our best clue into terms of how many evictions actually happen. So I think those two pieces of information would be good. But yeah, I'll hand it off to Phil. I'm sure he's got more thoughts on this.
Yeah, I mean, like the landlord info is really useful, kind of like Emina already touched on. Just I mean, I guess there's like the geographic information, like where are things happening, and just identifying who's being evicted. Like because of the process, so much of this is informal. So many people move out when they get a notice before even a hearing's filed. So there's no paper trail, especially with rent evictions, but I think all evictions. So identifying who's being evicted is tricky, figuring out geographically where it's happening to be able to support people in their community. But then the landlord information, I mean, so much of this information is not publicly available or costs money to get. Landlords hide behind shell companies, number companies, and it's really helpful for tenants to be able to identify other buildings their landlord owns, so that they can connect with other tenants and kind of organize together. So I think kind of those pieces of information are kind of the most useful, at least for tenant organizing. Depending on what kind of projects you're trying to do or what kind of research, there might be other information, but I think for organizing, it's really kind of those pieces.
Okay. My last question for all of you, I'm hoping each person could take a turn to respond about possible solutions to the crisis. There have been a range of proposals put forward to solve the eviction crisis and the homelessness crisis. For example, extended rent repayment plans, rent banks, more hotel rooms, temporary modular housing, etc. How do these proposals fall short? And what demands have your groups put forward instead? Maybe Jesse, we'll start with you, and then Brendan, and then Emina and Phil.
Sure. Solutions wise, I think that a lot of the solutions put forth are quite temporary and land people back in the same place, especially with the shelter hotel situation. It seemed like a good idea to get people off the street very quickly and move people from shelters really quickly. But as we've seen, there have been horrible overdose deaths or people being paired in rooms with people they don't know and being taken out of their community with very little choice, and ending up back on the streets. And so it seems like even with something like the hotels, where there was a plan put in place that was advocated for, there doesn't seem to be a next plan. Some of the modular housing seems pretty interesting, and a little bit more autonomous with some programs. However, if it is, again, temporary housing, that again doesn't really solve any solution. People are going to be back on the streets or, you know, in the shelter system and that kind of thing. Really, I think that the city needs a push for rent geared to income housing, truly affordable housing. And also that when people are in shelter systems or shelter hotels or temporary housing, that there's more opportunity to try to go from there to permanent housing instead of that being like an end space for people where they don't know where to go after that. So yeah, I think more rent geared to income housing, more affordable spaces, and less just putting someone in a shelter or shelter hotel and thinking that that's going to be some sort of solution when it comes to you know, homelessness and encampments and the rotating evictions that are going on there.
Brendan?
Yeah, I mean, just to echo what Jesse's saying, like homeless encampments are not the solution to the affordable housing crisis, right? In fact, the fight around encampments, I think, is what really is about forcing the city and the province and the federal government to reconcile with the crisis that's been created and to come up with those solutions. But it's not like the end goal is not the permanent existence or entrenchment of encampments. Like in terms of like a policy, like a really quick policy answer is addressing vacancy decontrol. So the fact that when a tenant moves out of a unit, the landlord can then charge anything that they want, incentivizes landlords to evict people. It causes rents to skyrocket. It, you know, and you know, and I like there's an article written by Martine August, which is just amazing, which talks about how at the same time that they scaled back rent control protections, all these like Mike Harris cronies got into the financialized landlord industry. So this is like landlords that are just like real estate investment trusts that buy up, you know, properties, and they exert these strategies to extract as much profit from these buildings and these units as they can. So like those were part of a concerted strategy to commodify housing and to make it, you know, harder for tenants and make more money for rich people. I agree. Like, I mean, there's like social housing, modular housing, like I don't really care, like in terms of that, the nitty gritty of that conversation. It's like there has to be an increased role for government in providing housing for people. And like, that's not an outlandish proposition. There are places in Europe where huge amounts of the housing stock is owned by the government, and it's well kept and it's in good repair. You know, unlike TCHC, which is like chronically underfunded and as a result is, you know, suffering. Like those buildings or many of those buildings are in horrible condition. Like some of them are good and people are happy with their units, but like that doesn't have to be, social housing does not have to be miserable to live in. And then it just like, it also like look at the context of that social assistance rates haven't gone up, wages have barely gone up, people's pensions aren't going up, and you have, you know, meanwhile landlords are applying for above guideline increases where your rent goes up, you know, 15% over 3 years. So like we need to have social assistance rates that are tied to the actual cost of living. We need to pay people properly so that they, you know, like if you're working a job, no one should live in poverty. But you know, like wages have to go up, and then an increased role for rent geared to income housing. I think those are some of the major solutions, I would say. And just like, you know, like in the 90s or like late 80s, early 90s, when the NDP was in power, they brought in pretty stringent rent controls, and all these landlords that were banking on, you know, being able to extract profit from people, they all ducked out of the industry because they're like, okay, well, we can't make as much money anymore. And that's where tenants actually organized, and they bought the co-ops that they bought the buildings they were living in and turned them into co-ops. Like bring in these policies that disincentivize or that decommodify housing, and people can own their homes, and they can own, the communities can own their homes.
Emina?
Yeah, I mean, I think the policy points put forward by the other panelists are all really great points. I mean, yeah, obviously things like having rent control, real rent control, more social housing, all of these things, would help tenants not being able to apply for these ridiculous AGIs, which is just like a cost of doing business that like then gets like pushed back onto tenants, of course. But I think we also have to acknowledge that if our politicians wanted to do these things, they would have already done them, right? And like, I think again, like talking to tenants, like we know this is all wrong, right? We see where this is headed. We know it's not in our interests. We know it's wrong. And even in a global pandemic, our government is still pushing forward legislation that actually weakens our protections and puts us in a more precarious situation. And even politicians on the left, what they're advocating for kind of falls short of what is needed, right? So, I mean, I think the reality is that if tenants and working class people don't do the organizing work to change the situation, we can't really expect that anything's going to change. So I think ultimately the answer lies in, the power needs to go back to the people, right? I mean, in terms of what we're advocating for in a more short-term sense, I mean, Keep Your Rent is advocating for no COVID evictions and also rent relief. Like, I think that's a key point. Like, for example, I think the NDP tabled some new legislation, basically asking for a more prolonged eviction moratorium. But the reality is, like, there's so many tenants who are just never going to, be able to catch up because, like Brendan said, like wages are stagnant, right? Like people are also not, making enough money. And every time, an apartment empties out, it's going to be more expensive. So we're asking our landlords for direct relief. We think that is like a key part of, stopping this crisis in the short term. But yeah, like in the long term, we need more organizing. And I think that's what kind of gets us to these other things, because obviously, like, unfortunately, I think the system has really failed us. So.
Phil?
Yeah, I don't think I really have anything to add to, I mean, I kind of second what all the other panelists have said and kind of the demands from the different groups that they're kind of representing. I guess anything that kind of works towards the decommodification of housing, I think would be good. And and that's only going to come, like Emina said, I think from tenants organizing and pushing for that. We can't expect that to just be handed to us by benevolent politicians. So,
yeah. Before we end the formal panel portion of the event, I wanted to ask, how can people follow what you're doing? How can people support you financially and otherwise? And just a reminder to everyone else on the call, if you have a question that you'd like to ask the panel, if you could type it into the chat, I'll gather them up and pose them. But Jesse, how about we start with you?
So for ESN, we've got our website to follow up with what's going on, encampmentsupportnetwork.com. It's got somewhere to donate and somewhere to contact. We are always looking for more volunteers as well, especially for things like driving. And we're on Twitter and we are on Instagram as well. If you type in ESN, we'll come up. And I believe that our system right now of donating is through Patreon. So we got to do that monthly dedication system. Yeah.
Thanks. Emina?
Yeah, I mean, there's lots of different ways to connect with Keep Your Rent. You can check out the website, keepyourrent.com, Facebook and Twitter, as well as the many great kind of local organizations that are doing the work in a more concentrated neighborhood level, like Parkdale Organized, like People's Defense, and other organizations. We don't take like money, this is just completely grassroots, so we don't take money. Having said that, there are tenant-led initiatives that could use some donations. So there's the West Lodge Food Bank. So this is 2 towers in Parkdale that are, have a lot of low-income tenants on ODSP. They're actually, I think, 1 in 5 to 1 in 4 households were we found behind on rent and potentially facing eviction there. And so the West Lodge Food Bank has been a great way to support tenants who need help, but also to organize with those tenants. So you can check it out at westlodgefoodbank.com. There's a similar initiative out in the East End. You can check out People's Defense for how, I'm not sure exactly where, if someone knows, maybe put it in the chat if they're involved in that, but there's a similar initiative as well that you can also donate to. And if I missed anything, people can feel free to shout that out.
Thank you. We'll move on to the Q&A portion now. Miles had a question about sheriff enforcement of evictions that Cole kindly answered in the chat. So thank you. Molly asks, have you found that the virtual or online aspect of hearings is causing problems for tenants dealing with eviction hearings? How is that going and what are the problems, if any? Brendan, maybe I'll pose that to you.
I also feel like the Keep Your Rent folks are people to talk to on that, because I think that the move to online hearings has just led to, like, the Landlord and Tenant Board rightfully has been just thoroughly discredited as an adjudicative body, and these stories, and I'm sure like everyone's heard these stories of like the board member learning that the tenant is dead and then proceeding with the eviction hearing anyway, and like board members that are like in clear conflicts of interest. And then on our end, like, I mean, we, all of our clients are low income people, and, access to, like, you're being dragged to the Landlord and Tenant Board because you can't pay the rent. Do you have internet access? Do you have a phone right now? And like, we hear stories of people like phoning into their LTB hearings on a payphone, standing outside waiting for their hearing to be called. Like the inequity of online hearings and the assumption that people are, able to access this technology in an equal way is just preposterous. And then there's just, it's just like an entire mess around people getting their notices, and it's not clear if like notices are being emailed to people or if they're being mailed out, and so tons of tenants are missing their hearings. So like the Landlord and Tenant Board was not ready for this, and they are still not ready for this, and they're not doing this properly. And it's leading to, like, I'd say like a mass scale of injustice.
Emina, do you want to add that?
The Keep Your Rent folks are the ones that are like really highlighting the unfair.
Yeah, I mean, I think Brendan outlined the problems really well. I mean, I guess the other thing I would say is an incredibly secretive process, right? So I mean, before, if people wanted to observe the hearings, they were just able to walk into, the local hearings and observe them, right? Now, the Landlord Tenant Board is not putting out this information anywhere. So I think the secrecy of it is a really big problem. Yeah, like absurd, like things like, ordering evictions for tenants who had already been deceased. What we're finding is there's been it's been really hard to get a hold of the landlord tenant board. So people had questions. I mean, like, I know I tried to call them and get some information. I couldn't get through repeated times. When I finally did, I was put on hold for 45 minutes. And then when I asked for my piece of information, I was told that I would have to ask the landlord tenant board, the people I was literally on the phone with, right? So, okay, you put a tenant in that situation who's maybe not up to date on, you know, the latest changes in law, who needs to submit evidence for their hearing, or doesn't even know how to do that or what the process is, right? Like, so the idea that some sort of justice is being like carried out here is, like, I think, you know, a little bit of an absurd situation. But I mean, regardless, like, the process doesn't really allow for, you know, rent forgiveness for compassionate reasons. Like, there are, you know, the board has to, you know, consider like the tenant situation, but like what we're seeing is we're not seeing people, you know, granted rent relief because of COVID or anything like that, right? People are still getting evicted. Maybe they get a little bit longer or whatever, right? But it's still a horrible, unjust process. And again, like, I think we can all see that it's wrong, and yet it continues, right? So yeah, I think it's been just a huge mess, right? So
Just and one more issue I'll point out that it just came to mind is that accessing duty counsel, like lawyers that are there to help tenants on the day of their hearing, has been super difficult. And like duty counsel is having to bounce around from hearing to hearing, and they're not getting to everybody in the. I mean, not that they ever were sufficiently equipped to handle it, but that's another issue.
There's a question about squatting. How nasty are squatting laws in the city, and what is the history of squatting in the GTA? I don't know if anyone feels equipped to respond to that. I know they're more harsh here than in other places. I was gonna ask Brendan, the lawyer in the room, but
yeah, we have no adverse possession here, so it's not like in England you hear these stories of like anarchist communes that like take over a building that hasn't been in use, and you're like, yeah, it's but we don't have that history, that tradition here.
There's a question for Jesse. Can you expand a little more on rapid response as an organizing strategy and practice, or any other practices that ESN has found useful in contesting encampment clearances and displacement?
Rapid response is essentially just it's a network of people who keep their phones on and are willing to show up somewhere, basically when they're called to help either advocate for people who are being evicted, to film, to talk to, try to be a liaison with the cops. At this point, there are people with numbers to the folks at Streets to Homes, who are the people who tend to survey and hand out the evictions, or like are the liaisons for the evictions themselves. So rapid response, yeah, it's just having a dedicated amount of people who are willing to kind of get up and go, and like a big list. Yeah, that's that. And what was the other question? Like any other organizing tools?
Yeah.
I guess just social media is such a big one. Like if you film the city all being assholes and toss that around, it will get seen, and counselors will feel embarrassed, and the pressure does work when it comes to that kind of stuff. There have been a few really good actions as well. Like there's an action in Moss Park that had a that had a march with it, and then had videos of folks from encampments, with their consent, of course, played on buildings that were all like unused, and talked about expropriating spaces. So awareness is a huge one. It really embarrasses the city, which I think is a little bit important right now with the evictions.
I'll pose this next question to Phil. How can people on this call start organizing against COVID evictions in their building or neighborhood?
I think I'll say a little bit, but I think Emina probably has a little bit more insight here. I think probably the first step is just talking to your neighbors. A lot of times I think people feel that they're going through something alone, but especially in this crisis, we know that you're living in a building and you're facing eviction, chances are there's someone else, if not in your building, on your floor, who's going through the same thing. So talk, or if they're not going through it, at least they'd be willing to kind of support you and support efforts to keep you in your home. So I think talking to your neighbors, talking to, whether it's in your building or neighboring buildings, people who are living in your neighborhood. Equally, if you're not facing eviction, but you suspect that there might be some of your neighbors who are, or if you've seen the Evictions Ontario website and you've seen that map of evictions, talk to your neighbors and see who in your neighborhood is at risk of eviction. And then just start organizing together. Reach out to other tenants who have the same landlord, reach out to Keep Your Rent, reach out to more tenants in your community to try to put pressure on the landlord to not evict people during a pandemic. But I think Emina might have a little bit more to say about this.
I mean, not really. I think you covered it well, Phil. I mean, yeah, I think number one is like talk to your neighbors, like, and that can, like, taking the first step can also sometimes be the biggest resistance, right? Like, I think we're often the most afraid of our own neighbors because we're like, like, what if, you know, they don't feel the same way, and I have to pass them in the hallway and whatever. But like, once you start having those conversations, like, really great things can happen, and you can start building power, and you can start, you know, organizing better conditions, not just for evictions, right? Like, you can get your repairs done, you can get your pest control, you can start organizing around lots of other things. So yeah, like, talking to your neighbors is definitely number one. And then, like, obviously, like, we're here to help, and like, we have, you know, connections to many tenants in different parts of the city. So please reach out. We can always, like, help you figure it out and figure out a strategy that works for you in your building and in your neighborhood.
Yeah, and just on the talking to your neighbors, like, if you're worried because of the pandemic, it doesn't have to be door knocking. You could put flyers under doors. You could put posters up in your lobby with a number, or set up a group chat or an email address for the building. Like, there's lots of ways to connect with tenants, or if you're a little bit shy doing flyers the first time and maybe some people will reach out to you, that could be another way to reach tenants.
Emina, are there any recent wins or movement from tenant organizing worth highlighting? How have tenants been building on these?
Yeah, it's a good question. Was it, I think, beginning of last month, we stopped an eviction in the West End. Now, this was a tenant who had reached out to us. You know, basically the sheriff was, you know, going to be coming the next day to evict them and their family. Really terrible situation. And, you know, because there was already good organizing happening in that neighborhood and with that landlord, you know, tenants were able to stop the eviction that day, put pressure on that landlord to stop that eviction. And then, you know, since then we built on that. So that day, you know, we let neighbors know, hey, did you know, like, one of your neighbors who's lived here a really long time and has kids, and, is in a really precarious situation. They're going to be getting evicted. And do you know about your landlord and what they do? They just bought your building. Do you know what their history is, what they do when they buy buildings, right? And so in that way, we've been able to kind of build in that building. I also I already mentioned West Lodge, but I just wanted to give them another shout out. I mean, someone mentioned squats and things like that. I mean, this isn't exactly the same situation, but they held on to a vacant unit in their building. So the landlord, formerly Timber Creek, now Hazelview, has held on to like something like 200 vacant units in those buildings, which is, I think, speaks to how much money they have, like how deep their pockets are, and also how little they care about housing people in a crisis. But anyway, tenants held on to that unit for the West Lodge Food Bank, and then were able to successfully negotiate getting a unit for their food bank. So I think that was a great and cool win. I know there's tenants in East York who are currently fighting to have their hearings heard together and hear evidence together. So that's something to watch as well. And I think those are just some of, a few things that have happened recently that I think tenants can feel good about.
Just to the folks, I've received a few private messages about specific legal issues. I don't think we'll discuss that on this call, but I'd encourage you to look up your local legal clinic in Toronto and call them for help. I had a question about like the process of organizing, and it's sometimes messy, and people arrive with their own ideas, sometimes like racist, sexist, anti-immigrant, just like anywhere in Canadian society. But how does this factor into the organizing process, both with tenants and with houseless people, and how do you see the organizing process as a way to like confront those ideas and overcome them? Jesse, maybe we'll start with you.
That's a big question and a tough one. And yes, organizing is definitely messy. I think with the greater ESN, it kind of started with having a little bit of a vetting process. Like someone would have to know someone and kind of vet for the fact that their politics weren't going to be, against kind of what we believe in as a group. However, that doesn't mean that we haven't had our struggles definitely as well. When it comes to working with folks in encampments, I mean, everyone who's being helped is going to have their own politics and is going to be coming from a very different background, and it's tough. We try to just help everyone as best we can, and we're not always going to agree with everything with every bit of politics with those that we're helping, but we want to make sure that we as a group keep our politics in check. So I guess, just having a little bit of a vetting process has been our way to do it, and really making sure that we meet with everyone who's going to be a part of our group so that we all feel comfortable.
Emina?
I mean, I wouldn't say that's going to be your experience in organizing with most tenants, but certainly, sometimes you'll talk to tenants and they'll express certain ideas about their neighbors, which, these prejudices can be based on a lot of different things. I mean, it's obviously a challenging thing. And obviously, when you're talking about, people taking on, I leadership roles in a sort of like flat organization, but obviously you want to keep those things in check. But I think it's also just like focusing on the issues at hand, right? And what are the common issues, and challenging people on those issues. So if they say something like, well, you know, they're X kind of person, and so I don't know if I really want to help them because, you know, X kind of people make lots of noise, they're bad neighbors, blah, 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 blah. And start challenging them on this. I think sometimes you can make progress, right? And start moving beyond these kinds of things, right? So you're like, okay, well, okay, your neighbor makes noise. Do you think that person deserves to lose their home? Do you think this puts us all in a safer position in a global pandemic where, you know, the thing we're told to keep us the safest is being at home, right? And I think in those ways you can move on from those things. I mean, obviously, you know, there can be people who are really toxic, right? And I think you do have to watch out for that and have those discussions together, right? As a community, you know, in your building, in your neighborhoods, about how you want to approach those things. But yeah, it's obviously a challenge, but I think that's kind of some of the ways that we approach that. I don't know if anyone else has thoughts on that.
Okay, I don't see any more questions, so I'll just keep asking my own. What's your read on how the landlord class is responding to this crisis and adapting and changing their investment strategy, their legal strategy, their property management strategy, and what are some opportunities that organized tenants could exploit?
Like, I mean, in terms of the landlord strategy, I think so far they're holding their landlord like class interests in solidarity with each other, like through like the FRPO. I mean, I guess a lot of the bigger ones, as we said, have been a little bit more careful, I guess, in terms of not wanting to seem like the worst, right? So maybe they have been a bit more hands off in terms of sending out eviction notices and things like that. And, you know, a lot of their response to us is sort of indirect, right? So they're still not, you know, conceding that they have to negotiate with us collectively on unpaid rent and things like that. But they're being more hands-off in terms of evictions, or they're going to the government and saying like, hey, we'll actually like waive, you know, a quarter of the rent or whatever if you also put money forward. So I think that's sort of how their response has been. So certainly I think you know, it's up to us to continue to put the pressure on landlords to get more of a response. In terms of like property management and stuff like that, I'm not really sure. I mean, most of them are still doing just fine and making lots of money. Like, I think there's been this narrative in the media that it's like, oh, it's a renter's paradise. You can get a free month's rent and a gift card to Amazon, or I don't know what the hell they're giving, but I think we're hearing this narrative. But then when you look at the actual numbers, especially when it's like, when you stop looking at like condos and sort of like higher end rental units, we're still seeing that they're making lots of money, maybe not as much. I mean, I think you've seen a consolidation of like property management for a while now, even before COVID. So, I mean, sometimes you'll have offsite superintendents and things like that. In terms of organizing, I mean, I think it depends what people are looking for. Like, not having a superintendent there might make it easier to talk to each other, right? Because you maybe don't have to worry about the on-site management. On the other hand, maybe you want that super, like maybe, you know, you're like me, you live in an older building that needs more attention and you want someone on site to deal with those issues. So I think it kind of, you know, you always have to respond to what's happening in that situation and look at it that way, I think.
Thanks very much. We're nearing the end now. I wanted to give everyone, each panelist, you know, one last opportunity. Anything that we didn't cover that you wanted to discuss, and then we'll call it. Brendan, maybe starting with you.
I don't know, in terms of stuff. Yeah, I don't know. I like I think I'm good at this point if there's like something specific, but yeah, thanks for organizing this and for having me. I appreciate it.
Phil?
Sorry. I don't really have anything to add. I guess I'd just say if you're not facing eviction or not at risk of homelessness, then I would try to find people who are and try to support them, whether that's connecting with Keep Your Rent or ESN, and trying to do what you can to support people and support the organizing that's going on around the city.
Jesse?
Yeah, I think that what was just said was great. You know, if you have a home and you're not being evicted, try to find someone to or somewhere to help out. Sorry, I get very shy on the internet. And I would say other ways are if you live in a community where there's an encampment specifically, and you know there are neighborhood groups that are being that are uncomfortable with it or any of that kind of stuff, just like chatting with your neighbors about encampments, or wandering over and saying hi to some of the people that are living in some of the parks and asking what people need. You know, like you might develop relationships with folks that you didn't realize had amazing stories to tell, and you know, you might just have a greater understanding of what's going on in the city if you know how people end up in those positions. So yeah, I guess just wanted to say that encampments don't have to be a scary thing to have in one's neighborhood.
Emina?
I don't really have that much to add. So I'll just reiterate, talk to your neighbors, organize with your neighbors, and you know, a lot can be accomplished, and we can really make a lot of positive changes. And certainly, if we don't, we're headed for a bad spot. So let's head to a good spot and organize. Thank you.
Great. Thanks everybody. Thanks Jesse, Emina, Brendan, and Phil for taking the time to do this and sharing your knowledge and experience with everyone here. Thanks to everyone who joined us for this event and for your questions. We do run these panels monthly, so you can watch our social media channels for the next one if you're interested. If you have any suggestions for future events, feel free to get in touch with us. And have a good night. Thanks.